There have been assessments saying that 2025 or 2026 would be the time when Russia's offensive finally starts to run out of steam if they don't get major support from their other partners in the coalition, like more troops coming from North Korea, for example. But that makes it all the more baffling that now President Trump has effectively rescued Putin from the consequences of his misguided misadventure by saying, okay, we'll freeze the conflict here so that you have a chance to recover.
The world is now waiting for a word from Vladimir Putin. The US Ukraine plan proposes a 30-day ceasefire, the exchange of prisoners of war, and the release of detained civilians. That includes the return of an estimated 20,000 children who were taken from Ukraine and handed over to Russian families. In the meantime, the United States will again share its intelligence with Ukraine and restart military aid. So the big question this lunchtime is, will the Kremlin accept? Keir Giles is a Russian analyst at the think tank Chatham House. Good afternoon, Keir.
Hello there. Good afternoon.
What is in this deal for Mr. Putin?
Well, it's hard to say because so many of the features of the deal are unknown or non-existent. There's a lot that we just don't know about how this ceasefire is supposed to work, not least how it is supposed to be monitored, how it's supposed to be enforced. Let's not forget that we've had previous ceasefire arrangements in Ukraine, which Russia has been able to flout at will. And most of all, what Ukraine and Ukraine's neighbors thought was most important, some way through which the ceasefire can actually be turned into a permanent peace and not just risk freezing the conflict at the current front lines and therefore giving Russia the wins that they were looking for. So there is so much that we simply are not aware of about exactly how this is to work. But we do know that Russia now has the opportunity of sitting back, taking its time. There's no point in signing up to a ceasefire if Russia feels that it can press home its military advantage at the moment. And Russia also has the opportunity to demand more in order to sign up. So much has already been granted to Moscow in terms of the deals that were put on the table before these negotiations even started. No NATO membership for Ukraine, no aspiration to re-liberate those occupied territories where Ukrainians are living under that savage Russian military occupation, and so on. So we shouldn't be surprised if Putin comes back with a request, whether it's public or covert, for sanctions relief or for permanent guarantees that there won't be any security for Ukraine. It's all in Putin's court, as we've heard.
What is Mr. Trump's big lever in that situation? Is it, as you say, sanctions relief, for example?
There's no indication at all in public that the Trump administration has been willing to put any pressure or leverage on Russia at all. And so far, everything that we have seen is compelling Ukraine to sign up to a ceasefire arrangement in which Ukraine has been very clear about the dangers, all of the ways in which this could actually be detrimental to Ukraine's security in the long term. But they've been strong-armed into it through the cutting off of military aid, through the suspension of intelligence support, through other measures that have been less prominent, like, for example, cutting the funding for Ukraine to try to regenerate its critical national infrastructure while Russia is destroying it. So that's all on the Ukrainian side. There's no evidence of anything in the way of pressure that's being put on Moscow to uphold its end of the bargain, if there is one.
I talked to Robert Wilkie, who was Donald Trump's Secretary for Veterans Affairs yesterday. And this time round, he was on the transition team for the Trump administration. And he said he thought, actually, you didn't need to do too much because the Russians would come around because they've actually started to run out of resources and people. Um, do you credit that?
It's a pretty widespread assessment that Russia was running out of time, whether it's resources, people, military manpower, materiel, all of those things. There have been assessments saying that 2025 or 2026 would be the time when Russia's offensive finally starts to run out of steam if they don't get major support from their other partners in the coalition, like more troops coming from North Korea, for example. But that makes it all the more baffling that now President Trump has effectively rescued Putin from the consequences of his misguided misadventure by saying, okay, we'll freeze the conflict here so that you have a chance to recover.
The Trump style of diplomacy rests a great deal on personal contact, doesn't it? Do you think that what's really going on here is that, number one, he just wants it settled because he's obsessed with China, but number two, he just thinks that the phone call that he can make is the thing that's going to make the difference?
Well, the argument that this is all to do with preparing the United States for confrontation with China, settling one conflict so that you can move on to the next, is something we're hearing a great deal from the Trump camp at the moment, trying to rationalize what is happening. Now, if only there were more actions that actually supported that theory. Instead, we see not only the elements of US power that are obstructing Russia in Europe, but also around the world now being frozen, being impeded, being cut back. You can't pretend that you are getting ready to confront China if at the same time you're making major cutbacks in your parts of your military forces that actually enable you to project power. So, in terms of the personal relationship, of course, all of this is bound up with the relationship between Trump and Putin. But it's a very one sided relationship. It has always been Trump pandering to Putin rather than the other way around. A little bit of flattery and a little bit of ego inflation is all that comes back from Moscow, but it's enough to keep Trump on side with the Kremlin.
We're a long way from the end of this story, I suspect. Thank you so much. Keir Giles is a Russian analyst at the think tank Chatham House. The trade war has gone global today. President Trump's 25% tariffs on aluminium and steel imports came into effect this morning, and the EU is retaliating. It's imposing £22 billion worth of tariffs on the United States goods. The United Kingdom, for its part, is holding off, hoping for a trade deal between us and the United States. But the Exchequer Secretary, James Murray, told Times Radio Breakfast that Britain reserves its right to retaliate. Well, we'll see. David Hennig is the UK director of the think tank European Centre for International Political Economy, and he's worked on trade for the government for a number of years. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon.
Look, the United Kingdom exports just about £350 million worth of steel to the United States. Sounds like a big number, but in fact, it's not that big. Is this steel tariff on steel a problem for us, or is it just a minor annoyance?
There's a couple of reasons why it's a little bit of a bigger problem than that makes it sound. So these tariffs that have been introduced are not just on steel and aluminium, but they're also on products derived from steel and aluminium. And that takes the value up a fair amount towards the billion and beyond, I think, mark. The second reason, of course, is that the UK steel industry is not in a particularly healthy state, so it really can't afford any losses. Now, all countries are being hit by these tariffs. There are no exemptions, so it's possible that the UK isn't going to lose too badly out of them. But it's certainly a concern given the trials of the UK steel industry that we're well aware of.
Mr. Trump actually appears to have it in for the EU rather more than the United Kingdom. The EU tariffs focus on food and drink. There are communion wafers, vapes, negligees, and various bits of machinery. I'm keen on the question about communion wafers and negligees. First, how does anything get on this list? I mean, this is the EU's list.
Essentially, people will have been working away for a number of months to identify products where a reasonable amount may be coming from the US, but where there are easily accessible substitute suppliers. So essentially, you're trying to send a message to the US that it's, they're going to lose, but we're not going to lose because we've got other suppliers of, well, presumably communion wafers and negligees and the other products that you mention. Now, the UK will almost certainly have a similar sort of list, but the UK is more concerned that we're smaller and that it would probably be better to seek a deal than to take retaliation. It will be interesting to see whose method comes up better with President Trump.
Yes, it's. I mean, sorry, I'm a bit fascinated by the communion wafers because it brings to mind that.
Well, I'd need to check. I'm afraid I'm not sure where where communion wafers are supplied from, apart from the US. I wasn't even aware they were supplied with the US. Maybe they're not. These are sometimes symbolic products that have very little trade, but sort of there may be one manufacturer who might be affected, who's in a particularly Republican state. It's always possible.
Yeah, it's just, the reason it's coming into my mind is it calls to my mind Stalin's remark to Churchill, supposedly, when Churchill asked about something that Stalin wanted to do and said it might offend the Pope. And Stalin said to Churchill, well, how many divisions does the Pope have? I'm just thinking whether the Vatican goes to war with Washington over communion wafers. But anyway, Trump himself. Look, the whole issue of tariffs are going to hit his voters, don't you think?
Well, over the coming months, it is likely that the tariffs will have upward pressure on US prices on particular goods. Obviously, it's already had a pretty negative effect on the stock market. The tariffs coming in, particularly the tariffs being announced, then being withdrawn, and the constant toing and froing around tariffs. So, yes, there's likely to be some impact, and over time, that the expectation is that he will become less keen to put on tariffs over time as the impact becomes clearer to voters, as the price of goods in the US goes up. And that this is something for other countries, therefore, to survive for a certain amount of time, and then hopefully things will get better. On the other hand, at the moment, Trump hasn't been showing that much interest in whether it would cause pain or not. In fact, he even said at the weekend that he didn't mind if it caused pain because he was on trying to remake the whole US economy. So we have to see how the pain comes about. It seems to me that the flip-flopping around is a recognition of the fact that that there may be damage, and that is starting to play into US calculation.
If you had to lay a bet, do you think that there's any chance that we will get that longed-for deal with the United States, that is UK only, at any time soon?
Well, I think that what the UK government is trying to do is not really the long-awaited trade deal. I think this one is can we be exempted from all your tariffs, including the ones you haven't announced yet? And I think there's at least some chance of getting that, but it's no better than 50-50. And there's always a danger that by trying to negotiate a deal, you come to Trump's attention and he puts even more tariffs on you. So I think we may get something with the US. Trump does seem to quite like the UK at the moment. He doesn't like the EU, but the EU will see if retaliatory tactics work better. I think at the moment, I'm not ruling it out that the UK succeeds.
Okay, maybe somebody needs to see if there's a knighthood available for President Trump, because that might help.
Oh, at the very least.
David Hennig, UK Director of think tank European Centre for International Political Economy. Thank you so much for your time.